The production possibilities frontier is an economic model used to illustrate how people and nations should decide what goods to produce, how much to produce, and for whom they should produce it. It's a model and a concept that looks at only two goods at a time. For example, what combination of cars and computers should a nation produce? The production possibility curve illustrates all the possible combinations of how we can produce these two goods, given the constraints we have, including the fact that resources are scarce. The question we're answering in this lesson is, what causes the production possibilities curve to shift? Before we answer this, let's review some of the basic ideas about the production possibilities curve using two types of curves. Let's say we have a production possibility curve showing the production of two goods, cars and computers. Now, economists also use the PPF model to illustrate two categories of goods, both consumer goods and capital goods. So here's what that PPF curve looks like. In any economy, investments into capital goods will do more to increase economic growth than investments into consumer goods will. For both of these types of curves, though, every point along the curve is efficient, meaning this combination of producing two goods is at our capacity. We're producing the most that we can with the least amount of costs. Movement along this curve reveals the trade-offs that are required to produce more or less of a good. We said that any point inside the curve is not efficient, and any point outside the curve is unobtainable. The best example in history of when America's economy was inside the curve was during the Great Depression. At that time, unemployment was extremely high, and production was extremely low. But eventually, during World War II, our economy moved from inside the curve to somewhere on the curve. Now we're producing things as fast as we can, largely driven by the war, but we were on the curve. Even though we were producing a lot more, we still had a limit, a capacity that we couldn't exceed, unless something major changed. And that's why any point that is outside the curve is not possible. The production possibilities curve, whether it's showing two specific goods, such as cars and computers, or two types of goods, such as capital goods and consumer goods, it shows us how much is produced, which means it's showing us a picture of output. So now we can talk about shifts in the entire curve. The basic idea is that anything that causes economic output to increase or decrease will shift this curve. In any economy, the major goal that you're trying to achieve is growth, which is to say, producing increasing amounts of the goods and services that consumers demand. Given the fact that resources are scarce, we have constraints, which is what the curve shows us. When the economy grows and all other things remain constant, we can produce more. So this will cause a shift in the production possibilities curve outward or to the right. If the economy were to shrink, then of course the curve would shift to the left. We're talking about the production possibilities model in this lesson, and the classic version of the production possibilities model is the comparison between two goods that a nation can produce, either guns or butter, and it must choose between these two goods. Now, famous people in history have used this analogy, including William Jennings Bryan, Margaret Thatcher, and even leaders in Nazi Germany. In fact, the song Guns Before Butter was written in 1979 by Gang of Four about this concept. The production possibilities model is a visual model of scarcity and efficiency. It simplifies the concept of how an economy can produce things, using only two goods as an example. It's going to show us all the production possibilities we have between these two goods. It takes the concept of opportunity cost, which we already explored, and helps us make the best economic decision we can make, which is to say, the most efficient decision. But there are some important assumptions that we need to talk about regarding the production possibilities model. So the question we're trying to answer is this: how much of each good should we produce in order to produce them in the most efficient way? For example, how many term papers and cookies should I make to get the most efficient combination? Or how much corn versus how much beef should country A produce to be the most efficient? That's where the production possibility model comes in. There are three important assumptions involved in using the production possibilities model. One, resources are used to maximize capacity. Very important. Two, resources are scarce. And three, technology remains completely constant. We're trying to use our resources to the fullest, but we only have limited or scarce resources. We're also assuming right now that the technology we use to produce our goods isn't changing at all. So what are we really saying? If you're producing the right combination of two goods, then you're using your resources efficiently. Why is this important? Because it reveals to us all the trade-offs of changing our production possibilities. We can pick any 2 points on a production possibility curve and explain the trade-offs or the opportunity cost of producing different combinations of these two goods. For example, if our economy is producing cars and computers only, then we can choose to produce many different combinations of cars and computers. Since our resources are scarce, we can't produce as much as we want. But we can produce, for example, 0 cars or 10 computers. We could choose instead to produce 5 cars and 0 computers. Why are these two numbers different? Because in this example, these two activities have different production rates. And when we compare the production rates, we can speak in terms of opportunity cost, like this. If we make 10 computers, we lose the opportunity to make 5 cars, and vice versa. By reducing this fraction down, we can say the opportunity cost of producing 1 car is 2 computers. As you can see, it takes more time and resources to produce a car than it does a computer. And the production possibilities model will show us this visually. Now, I just said that we could produce 0 cars and 10 computers, or 5 cars and 0 computers. But there are many other production possibilities in between these two that we could choose instead. With our finite resources, we could choose to produce 2 cars and 6 computers, or 4 cars and 2 computers. Then again, we could say 3 cars and 4 computers. When you account for all the possible combinations given the opportunity costs of 1 car equals 2 computers, you end up with a line like the one you see here in this simple example. Okay, time out. I want to clarify something important. Although the production possibilities model shows a straight line in this example, in the real world, the production possibilities model is a curve. As you produce more and more of one good instead of another, the opportunity costs will increase because some of the resources in an economy are only capable of producing one.
If economics is all about how people use their scarce resources to try to satisfy their unlimited wants, then it might be a good idea for us to think about what the term resources actually means. When economists talk about resources, they mean productive resources. The resources actually have to be able to produce something, a product or a service. So what kinds of stuff do we use to produce goods and services? We use people, fuel and energy. We use machines, factories, plants, animals. Okay, Clearly, a lot of things are used in the production of goods and services. Economists like to simplify things to make the story more intuitive, so what do you say we put all of the resources into just a few broad categories? Land is any natural resource. Sure, this includes land, like farmland or real estate, but it also includes trees, plants, livestock, wind, sun, water, oil. You get the idea. The category labor refers to any human service, physical or intellectual. You're adding to the package of labor services that you have to offer right now by learning. Some labor comes naturally, an athletic gift perhaps that allows you to play professional ball to earn a living, but you can certainly add to your package of labor services, sometimes referred to as human capital, through job training, experience, conferences, workshops, or education. The category of capital. Now, before I go one step further, let me say this. Money is not a resource. Remember what I said about resources? They need to be productive. They have to be used to make something else, and money can't do that. Don't get me wrong. Money helps the economy move along more efficiently, more smoothly. It's like grease for the economic machine. But in and of itself, it can't produce anything. It's used to acquire the productive resources that can produce goods and services. There's confusion that's understandable since most media refers to financial capital or investment capital, so it does refer to money. But what is economic capital? By definition, economic capital is anything that's manufactured in order to be used in the production of goods and services. Well, more simply, capital's machinery and equipment. This includes factory machinery, but also the factory itself, and computers, furnishings, books, roads, phone lines, etc. The last major resource category is entrepreneurial ability. What, or rather, who is an entrepreneur? An entrepreneur is someone who, first of all, is able to recognize a profit opportunity. Second, is able to organize the other factors of production, another phrase for resources. And third, is willing to accept risk. Look, do you know who Joe Johnston is? In the late 1980s, he and his partner left their engineering jobs and opened up a coffee shop in downtown Tempe. Now, what you have to realize is that at that time, the downtown area was, well, shall we say, a little less than desirable. It was just prior to the revitalization and renovation of that area. And, believe it or not, no one had ever heard of a little place called Starbucks, so quite frankly, I'm sure that people thought these two guys were nuts. Bad location, bad product, who ever heard of making a living selling coffee in the desert? Bad idea. Well, Joe and his partner took a chance, opened that first coffee plantation, and it was a hit. Within a few years, they sold it off for millions. These two guys saw a profit opportunity. There's 50,000 plus caffeine-starved students less than 2 miles away. Come on. They took the risk and organized the resources to start that business and make it successful. After selling the coffee plantation, Joe went on to other ventures, Joe's Barbecue, Joe's Farm Grill, and most recently, Liberty Market. That's entrepreneurial ability, folks. Next time, micro versus macro.
In this lecture, we'll look at how efficient and fair different resource allocation methods are. First, I'll start by explaining some of the possible resource allocation methods that exist. Next, I'll introduce the concepts of benefits, costs, and consumer and producer surplus. Then I'll talk about how the competitive market gives us the most efficient outcome. Lastly, we'll discuss if the most efficient outcome is quote-unquote fair. Let's start by explaining the different resource allocation methods that exist. Market price is an allocation method that allocates goods and services to people who are willing and able to pay for them. Those who cannot pay, or those who can afford to pay but are not willing to pay, will not get the resource. However, governments often subsidize or provide resources that are considered to be necessities. In Canada, the government provides infrastructure like roads and subsidizes public transit. In a command economy, resources are allocated by a central authority. This method is often used to allocate resources within businesses. The CEO often makes the important business decisions and allocates the company resources accordingly. This approach works well when it is clear who is in charge and what they are in charge of, but does not work when the range of activities that need to be monitored are too large. Basically, this method is not as effective for a scale as large as an entire country as it is for a company. Majority rule allocates resources based on what the majority of a population wants. Most Western countries use this method to elect governments, for example. This method works well when decisions being made affect a large number of people, but the process takes a long time to organize and is also quite expensive to organize. A contest allocates resources to one or a group of winners. This works when the efforts of the players, let's call them, are hard to monitor and reward directly. Consider a situation when a manager offers a prize. Everyone will work harder because they want the prize, even though only one or a few people will end up with that prize. Since everyone is working harder, output is greater, so the company is better off. However, there could be an incentive to cheat in this scenario to gain the resource unfairly. Allocating resources by a first-come, first-served method works when a resource can only serve one person at a time. Think about a bank ATM. You can only have one person using an ATM at one time, and so a line forms where the next person in line gets to use the ATM after the first person is done using it. A lottery system is a randomized way of allocating resources. It is often used to allocate electromagnetic frequencies in telecommunications, for example. It works well when there is no effective way to distinguish among potential users of a scarce resource. You wouldn't be able to rationalize giving one person the resource over another. Allocating resources by personal characteristics works in scenarios such as picking a dating or marriage partner. In this scenario, one often only looks at personal characteristics. However, if a company tries to allocate jobs based on personal characteristics that don't have anything to do with the requirements of the job itself, it would be considered discrimination. Force is different from a command system in that there may not be a single centralized authority giving out commands. In the case of property rights, the police would investigate a break-in and catch the thief, but the legal system would then process and sentence the robber. Neither the judicial system nor the police do both things. Using force allows governments to redistribute income in an economy. However, using force to redistribute wealth from one country to another by waging war is not a good allocation method. Let's move on and talk about the concept of allocative efficiency. We've talked about production possibilities and how all points on the PPF are productively efficient, but which point on the curve is the best point? This is what we will determine using the concept of allocative efficiency. The best point on the production possibilities frontier is the point at which goods are produced in quantities that provide the greatest possible benefit. I'll expand a bit more on the concept of benefit in just a bit. Allocative efficiency is achieved when goods are produced at the lowest possible cost and in quantities that provide the greatest possible benefit. In order to understand the concept of allocative efficiency fully, we'll need to introduce a few new concepts. The first new concept is known as marginal cost. Marginal cost is the opportunity cost associated with producing an additional unit of a good. In the graph to the right, we are assuming that we have an economy that produces only cola and pizza. The opportunity cost of producing more pizza is different on every point on the frontier. In fact, as we produce more pizza, we have to give up more and more cola every time. Let's calculate the marginal cost of pizza going from point B to point C. We use the rise over run method to calculate the slope of the PPF, which in turn gives us the opportunity cost of producing an additional unit of pizza. The change in cola, which is on the y-axis, is -2, and the change in pizza, which is on the x-axis, is 1. -2 divided by 1 is equal to -2. Thus, the marginal cost of producing pizza at point B is 2 units of cola. We are giving up 2 units of cola to produce 1 unit of pizza. We can do this calculation for every point on the PPF, and we can graph all the values we get for marginal cost. As you can see on the graph to the left, marginal cost is increasing. This is based on the premise that we have to give up more and more cola each time we want to produce an additional unit of pizza. I mentioned the word benefit before, and I will now expand a little bit more on this concept. Marginal benefit is defined as the benefit received from consuming an additional unit of a good. Benefit is subjective because people's own personal preferences affect the benefit they receive from consuming an additional unit of a good. The marginal benefit curve on the right shows the relationship between the benefit received per unit of pizza consumed and the number of units of pizza consumed. It is clear that the benefit received from consuming each additional unit of pizza is decreasing. We can thus say that the marginal benefit of consuming pizza decreases. This phenomenon is known as the law of decreasing marginal benefit. It applies to almost all goods in an economy. The more we consume of a good, the less benefit we gain from consuming even more. Marginal benefit is measured by the maximum amount of money that someone is willing to pay for an additional unit of a good. Let's define allocative efficiency in concrete terms by using the concepts of marginal benefit and marginal cost. The best point on the production possibilities frontier is the point at which we cannot produce more of one good without giving up some other good that provides greater benefit. The graph on top is simply the production possibilities frontier, and the graph on the bottom is simply that of the marginal benefit and marginal cost curves that we have just seen. In this first case, where we produce 1.5 units of pizza, the marginal benefit of producing pizza is greater than the marginal cost. This means that someone values that pizza and is willing to pay for it at a higher price than it costs to produce. We would get more value from our resources if we were to produce more pizza and less cola. The second point, where we produce 2.5 units of pizza, is the point at which we can say we have achieved allocative efficiency. Marginal cost is equal to marginal benefit, thus we cannot produce more pizza without giving up cola, which we now value more. The third point, at which 3.5 million pizzas are produced, is a point where the marginal cost of producing pizzas exceeds the marginal benefit. Pizza production costs more than people are actually willing to pay, so our resources would be better used if we produced less pizza. The point of this slide is to illustrate to you that the best use of our resources is at a point where the marginal cost of producing a good is equal to the marginal benefit of consuming that good. That in turn leads us to the best point on the production possibilities frontier of our economy.
So now we have a choice between two alternative possibilities. We can either choose one thing or another, but not both. For example, we could choose to spend our time knitting or walking, but not both. How do we know what the best economical choice is? By calculating the opportunity cost of each choice. Opportunity cost is a relative concept, which means that you're finding out how much of one thing you can produce in comparison to another thing. For example, if the two goods you're interested in are rice and wheat, then the opportunity cost of producing rice will always be in terms of wheat, and the opportunity cost of producing wheat will always be in terms of rice. The opportunity cost of choosing one possibility is the value of the possibility you gave up. It's what you sacrificed. It's not what you chose, but it's the next best alternative. Let's look at how to calculate opportunity cost using land as an example. In country A, we can use the same amount of scarce resources to produce two things, but we can only choose one thing at a time to produce. Let's say the two things we produce are corn and beef. We can use land to either produce corn or produce beef. The next thing we need to know in order to calculate opportunity cost is how much corn could we produce compared to how much beef we could produce. And remember that we're using the same amount of resources. So this kind of a problem really is going to give us the basis for comparing two alternative choices. Let's say that in country A, we can either produce 50 tons of corn, or as an alternative, we can produce 25 tons of beef. This is our trade-off between producing these two things. Now we have all the information we need to calculate opportunity cost. But we need to know which opportunity costs we're trying to measure based on which possibility we want to choose. Let's start by looking at it from the corn perspective. The opportunity cost of producing 50 tons of corn is equal to how many tons of beef we could have produced, which of course is 25 tons. Therefore, the opportunity cost is found by solving this equation. 50 tons of corn equals 25 tons of beef. What we really want to know is how much beef we could have produced if we chose to produce 1 ton of corn. But the question gave us 50 tons. To reduce this equation down.
So, what do graphs have to do with economics? Well, they provide a very useful way to build a simplified visual of how the world works. Okay, since economics is all about the choices that people make, let's look at an example that all of you have in common, how a student taking an economics class chooses to use his or her time. Let's make a couple of assumptions about our student. After carefully evaluating for time spent at work, sleeping, eating, social activities, family, there's 10 hours of study time each week. Also, data shows that most students who take economics are full-time, so let's assume that this student is taking a second course. I know, in the real world, full-time means 4 or more courses, but I'm going to limit the number of classes to 2. For one, it's hard to draw a diagram in 3 dimensions, and I'd like to see you try 4 or 5. For another, you'll see that even assuming only 2 classes, we can use this simplified model to illustrate how people make their choices. Now, what's the measurable objective of the student who's taking 2 classes, let's say economics and math, and has 10 hours per week to study? Grades. How well the student is doing is measured by grades. So let's put all of this information in graphical form. First, I set up my 2 axes and label each. One will be the grade in economics, the other will be the grade in math. What's the possible range of grades? Well, anywhere from F to an A, or since we're counting on this graph, anywhere from 0.0 to 4.0. This is true for the grade in economics axis as well as the grade in math axis. Now, our student goes to classes on the first day. Math class isn't very stimulating, but the econ class is great. You go home, check Blackboard, rewrite your notes, do the practice sets, form a study group, and before you know it, your 10 hours are gone. If indeed you put in 10 hours per week in economics, it's quite likely you'll get an A. But this leaves you with 0 hours to work on math. If you do no studying or homework for math, you're going to get an F. This is our first point on the graph. What if you begin to spend a little time each week on math? Maybe you start spending about 2.5 hours on math and cut back to 7.5 hours in economics. Well, the math grade is going to go up, and that's good news. Now you're at least getting a D in math. But because you took time away from economics, the economics grade is going to fall from an A to a B. And so on. I can follow this pattern. If I were to spread my time such that I was using 5 hours for each class, I would get a C in each class. If I decide to spend 7.5 hours on my math class, leaving me with only 2.5 hours for econ, good news is my math grade's up to a B, my economics grade's down to a D. Finally, I could spend all 10 hours on the math class, giving me an A in the math class, which is great, but that leaves me nothing to study for economics, and now I'm failing my economics class. Are there any other combinations the student could choose? Sure. He or she could pick, 7 hours and 3 hours, or 6.2 hours and 3.8 hours, or 1 hour and 9 hours. There are an infinite number of combinations. These would be shown in the diagram between the points we've already chosen. Did you notice that once we've included all the points, this looks more like a solid downward sloping line than just some collection of points? This is a production possibilities curve, or PPC, also referred to as a production possibilities frontier, or PPF. By definition, the PPC, or PPF, shows all possible combinations of output that can be produced, assuming two things. One, a fixed amount of productive resources of a given quality, and two, efficient use of those resources. Well, did we do all this stuff? Yeah, we looked at all possible combinations of output by examining all possible combinations of grades that were being produced. Fixed amount of productive resources is 10 hours of the student's labor, and efficient use of the resources, well, by definition, efficiency means that there's no unused or wasted or unemployed resources, and with every combination we made sure that the student was using all 10 hours, so there's no unused study time. The production possibilities curve illustrates the positive analysis, all possible ways in which the student can choose to use his or her time. Now for the normative question, what combination will the student choose? What point will the student choose? Well, it depends on the decision maker. A student might choose a C in both classes because at least they'd be passing both classes, but what if the GPA in your major matters more than your overall GPA? If you're a business student, you might choose a B or an A in economics then over a passing grade in math. Well, I can tell you aren't satisfied with these choices. You're thinking, can't I get an A in both? No. Under the current assumptions, 10 hours of study, this combination is currently unattainable. Could I ever get there? Well, sure, if you can get some more time from somewhere, those additional 10 hours somehow. Maybe if you cut back at work or dropped another class or stopped sleeping, I don't know. Could the student choose, say, a D in both classes? Certainly, but you're wasting your resources. You're not using all of your study hours for the intended purpose, which is getting the grades in the classes. So you see, even our very simple graphical model tells us a lot about how a person with more needs than resources must make decisions. Next time, opportunity. One outcome of the production possibilities model that's tough, yet very real world, is that without acquiring more resources, in order to get more of one kind of output, like a better economics grade, you must sacrifice some of the other output, like your math grade. This sacrifice is a fact of life, folks. It's called opportunity cost. By definition, opportunity cost is the highest valued foregone alternative when any choice is made. Look, think back to the example of the student. What was the opportunity cost of getting a better grade in economics? The student would have to accept a lower grade in math, so the sacrifice was the math grade. The full cost of any choice is not just the price tag. Although that direct out-of-pocket monetary cost does influence our decisions, the full cost also includes the opportunity cost. What gets sacrificed? That is to say, what else could you have done with your resources? Okay, here's an example of a choice that you have in common with the rest of the class. You opted to go to college. What is the full cost of that decision? Remember that the full cost of attending college is the sum of the direct, those out-of-pocket costs, and the indirect or opportunity cost. Is the opportunity cost really all that important? Can it influence a decision one way or another? Well, let's think it through and then decide. What are the direct costs of attending college? That is, what out-of-pocket costs will you incur? Tuition, registration fees, books, supplies, etc. Now, what are the indirect costs of attending college? That is, what could you have done with your time and energy if you weren't in college? What is it that gets sacrificed? Note that opportunity cost doesn't necessarily have to have a specific dollar price tag attached, just a value. Well, it might be that you could have been working. If this is the case, you could be sacrificing salary and or career advancement. Possibly you're giving up time that you could be spending with friends or family. For myself, one thing that was sacrificed was starting a family. I waited until I was finished with grad school to have a baby. Or maybe travel, or just leisure time. In the late 1990s, my husband worked at a .com, and he'd tell me how every day for 3 weeks, the newly hired CEO would stare out the window during meetings and mumble, "I could be out playing golf right now." Then the CEO quit. The decision to go to or stay in college is similar. If the opportunity cost is too high, the decision maker will decide not to attend. This often occurs with college athletes. If professional teams will hire them, then they could be sacrificing millions by staying in college. As a result, top athletes often leave college early for the pros. Going back to the original question, what is the opportunity cost of attending college? Well, it depends. Remember that by definition, the opportunity cost is the single highest valued alternative to that particular decision maker when any choice is made. The opportunity cost then varies from person to person. I even had a friend in college whose boyfriend, upon dumping her, informed her that she was the opportunity cost of attending college. She never cared much for economics after that. What is your opportunity cost of attending college? Even with all the costs associated with attending college, you decided to attend anyway. Why is that? Next time, society's production possibilities.
Meet Lilith. She owns a small startup tech company that manufactures smartphones and tablets. Lilith has some important business decisions to make concerning the allocation of her company's resources over the next fiscal year. A large part of her decision-making analysis will concern calculating and assessing opportunity cost. You can think of opportunity cost as the benefit or value you give up by picking one course of action over another. In other words, the opportunity cost of a decision is the difference between the value you receive from pursuing a course of action and the value that you would have received from the alternative you did not pursue. Let's look at Lilith's tech company to illustrate the concept. Lilith can use one day to manufacture either 100 smartphones or 75 tablets. If she chooses to manufacture the phones, the opportunity cost is the difference in profits of producing 75 tablets. On the other hand, if she chooses to manufacture the 75 tablets, it costs her the difference in profits of manufacturing 100 smartphones. We generally want to analyze opportunity costs in terms of investment, whether it's a person or a business making that investment. We can express opportunity cost in terms of a return or profit on investment by using the following mathematical formula. Opportunity cost equals return on most profitable investment choice minus return on investment chosen to pursue. Unless the investment returns are fixed and practically guaranteed to be paid, like a U.S. Treasury bond you intend to hold to maturity, you'll have to base your calculation on the expected returns. For example, on average, the stock market may have an annual return of 8%. But that doesn't mean your stock portfolio will return 8% this year. Now let's apply the formula to an example. Lilith's company has a 10% return when it sells smartphones, but an 18% return when it sells tablets. Let's plug in the numbers and see what happens. Opportunity cost equals return on most profitable investment choice minus return on investment chosen to pursue. Opportunity cost equals 18% return on tablets minus 10% return on cell phones. Opportunity cost equals 8%. If Lilith orders the production of smartphones, she'll have to give up the opportunity to earn an extra 8%. Of course, we are assuming that there is sufficient demand for tablets to expend all Lilith's production capacity on tablets. You can use an opportunity cost analysis to help you decide how to best capitalize a business. A business's capital structure is simply how a company finances its operations. Capital structure may involve a mix of long-term debt, short-term debt, and equity. Equity is the infusion of capital into a business through the sale of shares of common stock or preferred stock to investors.
In this lecture, we're going to be discussing the economic problem. We'll be looking at the reason why economies exist in the first place. The syllabus includes describing the production possibilities curve. We'll also define allocative efficiency and look at some of the costs of economic growth. We'll see the benefits we get from trading with other countries. And finally, we'll examine two different types of economies that exist in today's world. Let's start by talking about the production possibilities curve. To explain the concept of the production possibilities curve, Let us imagine that we are in some economy where only two goods are produced, food and clothes. In this economy, there is no international trade and no government either. In our economy, the production possibilities curve is showing us the upper bound, or upper limit to production. We can't produce outside the production possibilities curve because we don't have the resources to do that. Any point inside the curve is attainable because it is below the maximum possible production. Point A, for example, lies within the curve, and thus we can produce at point A. We can produce the quantity of clothes and the quantity of food at the same time because we have the available resources to do so. Any point on the production possibilities curve is also attainable. Point B, for example, lies on the curve. We are able to produce the quantity of food and clothes that is specified at this point. Point C, however, lies outside the curve, and thus we can't achieve this point. We don't have the resources to do so. The production possibilities curve represents scarcity because points outside the curve are not attainable. There is a limit to the amount of resources that we have, so we need to choose how to use them. This is the basic idea of scarcity. Production efficiency means that we are producing a good at the lowest possible cost. Any point on the production possibilities curve is considered to be productively efficient. All our resources are put to use, and so we are able to devote our best resources to the production of each good. Any point inside the production possibilities curve is considered to be inefficient. Let's think about it logically. We can move from point A to point B. This makes sense because both points are inside the production possibilities curve. You will notice, though, that to move from point A to point B, we don't produce any fewer clothes than we did before, but we are able to produce more food. This means that we had extra resources that we weren't using before. Resource use wasn't efficient because all our resources weren't being used. Thus, we couldn't have had productive efficiency at point A. Keep in mind that point B is still within the curve. Even it is still an inefficient combination of production of food and clothes. If point B were on the curve, then it would be considered efficient. The production possibilities curve illustrates a trade-off between our two goods. Let's say that we are producing on the curve at point A, and we want to move to point B because we need more food. We can see just by looking at the graph that in order to produce more food, we have to produce less clothes. This happens because we have a limited amount of resources. If you remember from a previous lecture, the resources in an economy are land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurship. We don't have an infinite amount of these resources, so we can't just continue to produce as much food as we want. There is a limit. And if we want to produce more food than before, then we have to divert some resources away from producing clothes and towards producing food. We'd have to pull workers away from clothing factories and send them to farms, for example. Opportunity cost is defined as the highest valued alternative foregone. This just means that whatever you're giving up in order to get something else is considered the equivalent of the cost. If you don't understand the next little bit, don't worry. I'll clear up any confusion with an example. Just bear with me. Opportunity cost is seen as a ratio. It is the decrease in the quantity produced of one good divided by the increase in the quantity produced of the other good as we move along the curve. Because this is a ratio we're talking about, the opportunity cost of producing more clothes in terms of food is simply the reciprocal of the opportunity cost of producing more food in terms of clothes. Like I said, just bear with me, this will all make sense in a minute. We can see that the opportunity cost of producing a good increases as the quantity of that good being produced increases. This is seen as the curve steepens. The logical reasoning behind this is because not all resources are equally productive in producing each good. If I ask a chef to start working in a clothes factory, he may not be able to produce as many clothes as a seamstress. Now to clear up any confusion, let's take a look at a concrete example. Let's say we start at point A and want to move to point B. Now we are producing one additional unit of food and one less unit of clothing. The opportunity cost, as we defined before, is the decrease in the quantity produced of one good divided by the increase in the quantity produced of the other good. So this would be equal to 1 over 1. The opportunity cost of producing one unit of food as we move from point A to point B is 1 unit of clothing. Now let's say that we move from point B to point C. Well, now we have to give up 10 units of clothing to produce one more unit of food. The opportunity cost here would be 10 over 1. This illustrates the fact that in order to produce more food, we have to start giving up even more clothes than before. If we want to go from point C to point B, the opportunity cost would be 1 over 10 units of food. This is the reciprocal of the opportunity cost.
So now you know that graphs can be used to illustrate an individual's choices. What about the choices facing a society? Well, who makes decisions on behalf of society? The government. What kinds of things does our government provide for us? Well, they provide things like roads, education, national defense, our justice system, research, unemployment benefits. The government's trying to do an awful lot of things for us all the time. In a sense, the government is just like us. They're trying to fulfill this many needs with this many resources. So, how do I tell this story using a graph? First, I want to narrow down the categories of things that the government tries to provide to 2. Why only 2? Oh yeah, I can only draw 2. Okay, let's say that our society has 2 categories of goods and services. Military, things like national defense, anti-terrorism programs, etc. And civilian, which might include roads, parks, or low-income support. You, as the economic analyst, have no say in what the society should do with its resources, but you can examine what we could do. If society takes every bit of its resources, all the land, all the labor, all the capital, and all the entrepreneurial ability, and puts it into the production of military goods and services, let's say that we can produce 5,000 units of military output. But this leaves no resources to produce civilian goods, so we would have 0 units of civilian output. Note that I'm not making any judgment as to whether this is a good idea or a bad idea, just that it's a possible choice that can be made. What if you want to consider having some roads or schools or parks? Let's say that you're considering building 1,000 units of civilian goods, maybe 1,000 schools or 1,000 miles of road. Where will the resources to produce 1,000 units of civilian goods come from? That's right. You'd have to take the resources away from military production. So military must decrease, let's say to 4,800 units. What's that? You think I've made some kind of a mistake? How could I possibly gain 1,000 units of civilian goods and only sacrifice or have an opportunity cost of 200 units of military goods? Well, consider this. What if civilian represents elementary schools and military is stealth bombers? Which one do you think takes up more resources? There's no reason why there would have to be a one-for-one trade-off. In fact, it would be unrealistic and restrictive to assume this. Okay, so what if I want more civilian goods, 2,000 schools or 2,000 miles of road? Then what? Yep, we would have to shift more resources away from military production, so that now civilian is 2,000, but military is only 4,500. This time you're sure I've made a mistake? How could I have sacrificed only 200 military initially, but now I'm giving up 300 military? No mistake. Instead of constant opportunity cost, as we had with the grades example, we now have increasing opportunity cost, where our sacrifice will just keep getting bigger and bigger. A PPC that shows increasing opportunity cost is actually much more representative of how the world works. It happens when resources are not as perfectly well suited for one type of production as the other. I'll come back to this in another video segment. Following this pattern of increasing opportunity cost, let's complete the table. To get 3,000 civilian goods, you drop to 4,000 military. To get 4,000 civilian, you drop to 3,300 military. To get 5,000 civilian, you drop to 2,000 military. And if you use every bit of society's resources for civilian output, you'll have 6,000 units of civilian goods, but not have any resources left for military production. Again, as the economic analyst, it isn't your job to decide which of these combinations is good or bad. So, who does get to decide? That's right, the government. Let's say that you're not only an economic analyst, but you're also presenting your data to the White House. Visuals are good, so take a few minutes now to pause this video, and map out the combinations with military on the vertical axis and civilian on the horizontal. Hopefully, yours looks something like this. Again, it illustrates the inverse relationship between military and civilian production. The bowed-out shape shows the increasing opportunity cost. You bring your charts and figures and explain to the President, Mr. or Mrs. President, this is the production possibilities curve, sometimes referred to as the production possibilities frontier, since it shows the outer limit of what can be produced with our current resources. What point will the President pick? Right again, it depends. Depends on what? Well, it could be any number of factors. Political ideology could determine where the President would pick. Your typical or average Republican, if there is such a thing, tends to lean more toward military. This is classic Reagan behavior. Democrats are often viewed as spenders, more on social programs closer to the civilian axis. Could be world events. In the early 1990s, after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the Soviet Union, we moved away from the military axis. But after 9/11, we moved toward the military axis. So, the President thinks it over carefully and finally says, I choose point H. What do you tell the President? Hopefully, you're making your response respectful, because after all, this is the President. So how about something like, oh, I'm sorry, Mr. or Mrs. President, but perhaps I've miscommunicated something to you. This line, the production possibilities curve, represents the outer boundary of what we can produce right now, even if we use all of the available resources. To which the President responds, ah yes, you did make a mistake, but I see now. I choose point I. What do you tell the President? Well, Mr. or Mrs. President, you certainly could choose point I, but then we would have resources going to waste. In particular, you might point out that unused resources are unemployed resources. More specifically, unemployed labor makes for unhappy voters. That usually works with politicians. The point is that while you, the economic analyst, do the positive analysis, ultimately the government decides where we should produce, the normative analysis. You demonstrate the possible outcomes, and it's up to the policymakers to make the final choice.
Meet Lilith. She owns a small startup tech company that manufactures smartphones and tablets. Lilith has some important business decisions to make concerning the allocation of her company's resources over the next fiscal year. A large part of her decision-making analysis will concern calculating and assessing opportunity cost. You can think of opportunity cost as the benefit or value you give up by picking one course of action over another. In other words, the opportunity cost of a decision is the difference between the value you receive from pursuing a course of action and the value that you would have received from the alternative you did not pursue. Let's look at Lilith's tech company to illustrate the concept. Lilith can use one day to manufacture either 100 smartphones or 75 tablets. If she chooses to manufacture the phones, the opportunity cost is the difference in profits of producing 75 tablets. On the other hand, if she chooses to manufacture the 75 tablets, it costs her the difference in profits of manufacturing 100 smartphones. We generally want to analyze opportunity costs in terms of investment, whether it's a person or a business making that investment. We can express opportunity cost in terms of a return or profit on investment by using the following mathematical formula. Opportunity cost equals return on most profitable investment choice minus return on investment chosen to pursue. Unless the investment returns are fixed and practically guaranteed to be paid, like a U.S. Treasury bond you intend to hold to maturity, you'll have to base your calculation on the expected returns. For example, on average, the stock market may have an annual return of 8%. But that doesn't mean your stock portfolio will return 8% this year. Now let's apply the formula to an example. Lilith's company has a 10% return when it sells smartphones, but an 18% return when it sells tablets. Let's plug in the numbers and see what happens. Opportunity cost equals return on most profitable investment choice minus return on investment chosen to pursue. Opportunity cost equals 18% return on tablets minus 10% return on cell phones. Opportunity cost equals 8%. If Lilith orders the production of smartphones, she'll have to give up the opportunity to earn an extra 8%. Of course, we are assuming that there is sufficient demand for tablets to expend all Lilith's production capacity on tablets. You can use an opportunity cost analysis to help you decide how to best capitalize a business. A business's capital structure is simply how a company finances its operations. Capital structure may involve a mix of long-term debt, short-term debt, and equity. Equity is the infusion of capital into a business through the sale of shares of common stock or preferred stock.
Whole societal scenario where the production possibilities curve or production possibilities frontier is fixed and the choice will be some point on that fixed curve stems from the original assumption that the resources are fixed. Just as a quick recap, what are the categories of resources? Remember, land is any natural resource, labor is any human service, capital, which is not money, is machinery and equipment, and the last category is entrepreneurial ability, where the entrepreneur is someone who, 1, recognizes a profit opportunity, 2, is willing to accept risk, and 3, is able to organize the other resources. But what if the resources aren't fixed? If resources change, what happens to production possibilities? The answer, of course, is it depends. If there are suddenly more resources, then there is a greater capability to produce, and the PPC moves outward or shifts to the right. Now, just to illustrate a side point, let me call the two broad categories of output agriculture, like wheat, and manufacturing, like computers. These categories are often used in production possibilities models because they use resources differently. Agriculture tends to be more labor intensive, whereas manufacturing tends to be more capital or machinery intensive. Why does this matter? Well, I just wanted to point out that underlying resources changes won't necessarily result in a nice, even parallel shift of the production possibilities. Consider this. Suppose we're producing efficiently using all of our resources operating on PPC 1. Then suddenly, someone discovers a fabulous new fertilizer that doubles crop yields. What happens to the possible agricultural output when you use all of the existing resources, plus you add this fabulous new fertilizer? You can now produce much more wheat than you could before. But what happens to the manufacturing output when you use all of the existing resources and then add fertilizer? Probably nothing. So the new PPC, PPC 2, does illustrate an expanded ability to produce, but it's an uneven shift. For now, though, just to keep things simpler, I'm just going to show even parallel shifts. So where were we? Okay, an increase in resources will result in an outward shift of PPC, demonstrating a greater ability to produce. Okay, then what happens if resources decrease? Fewer resources mean less ability to produce, so the production possibilities will shrink or shift inward. Now I want you to think about something. What does it actually mean to say that there's an increase or a decrease in resources? How does it happen? More specifically, how would a society see more land, more labor, more capital, or more entrepreneurial ability? In this table, I've gotten you started. Now you complete the rest. Next time,
let's say that you're the owner of a small restaurant and are trying to figure out how to get more food out of your tiny kitchen. You happen to have an expert chef, and you know that as long as your kitchen can cook it, your customers will buy it. As a result, you figure that if one chef is a good thing, 2 chefs could be an even better thing. Suddenly your output doubles. You buy blast chillers and salamanders, anything to help them cook faster. Your output increases further. Excitedly, you keep hiring staff and buying equipment. However, you notice that with each additional hire or purchase, you are no longer doubling your output. In fact, your staff spends more time complaining about the cramped kitchen than actually cooking. So soon your output has plummeted all the way to nothing. Your restaurant has just been the victim of a product curve. Product curves are upside-down bowl-shaped curves that show the relationship between additional inputs such as labor or capital and how much of a good is actually produced. Sure, it was a big help having 3 cooks on staff where before you only had a chef, but afterwards everyone started bumping against each other. Likewise, having more than just a stove and a refrigerator was a big help, until you had so many appliances that you couldn't use them all at the same time. Companies of all sizes face this sort of problem, and part of the goal of increasing efficiency is to extend that initial rise for as long as possible. Of course, most restaurant owners never make it to the point that they are unable to produce anything. In fact, long before, they would have run out of money. Now imagine having to chart the costs of all those new appliances and that big new staff. You may be selling everything that you are making, but now you have to pay for an increasingly large staff. Think about it like this. In a kitchen, only the people who cook the food actually produce a product. The wait staff, janitors, hostess, and managers all exist to support them. However, those employees all cost money. And the more of them that are hired, the more money
In the 1700s, famous economist Adam Smith taught us that countries should find out what they can produce more efficiently, which really means cheaper, better, faster, and then specialize in what they do best, trading with other countries who are also doing what they're best at. For example, let's say you're entering the job market and you're evaluating your options for a career. At the same time, your neighbor, Bob, is also evaluating his options. Now, you have an absolute advantage over Bob in baking cakes. Whether it's chocolate cake, vanilla cake, or pineapple upside-down cake, if both of you bake the same cakes side by side, you'd be the one who could bake 3 times as many cakes in an hour as he could. You're really good at baking cakes, and certainly better than Bob is, who's struggling to get the first cake rolling. Between the two of you, you are the best at it. And in economics, we say that you have an absolute advantage over your neighbor when you can produce a good more efficiently in the same amount of time. When we take the same concept and apply it to the world economy, we find that some countries have an absolute advantage at producing goods. Why is that? Because resources tend to be different in different countries. One country is rich in oil, while another country has an abundance of coconuts. And when resources are different, it tends to create absolute advantages. This idea became the basis of international trade for many years. If everyone exports what they're best at, then most countries will be better off because they'll be able to produce and sell more, and they'll have access to a lot more goods and services that other countries produce more efficiently than they do. But absolute advantage is different than comparative advantage, and it's important to know the difference. Another famous economist, David Ricardo, saw the great ideas that Adam Smith had about absolute advantage, but also saw some limitations. For example, if everyone simply does what they're best at and trades with the rest of the world, it is possible that some countries aren't best at anything, or at least maybe they haven't discovered it yet. David Ricardo would look at the same career example that we just talked about between you and your neighbor and notice something very important. He would notice that not only are you better than your neighbor at baking cakes, but you have the skill to be a rocket scientist as well. And in order for you to choose a career as a cake boss, designing incredible, enormous cakes for weddings and special events, you'd have to give up or sacrifice the opportunity to pursue an even more profitable career, starting a company that designs rockets that take people into space for short vacations, let's say. Economist David Ricardo taught us about opportunity cost, which is what you have to give up in order to make a choice. In your case, to choose your absolute advantage as a cake boss, you would have to give up a rocket design career worth even more to you. So this led to the theory of comparative advantage, which says that nations should specialize in producing the good in which they have the lowest opportunity cost. In the end, people would not only look at absolute advantage, but they would also consider comparative advantage when deciding what goods to produce and for whom to produce them. So here's an important point to remember.
In this section, I wanted to touch on the gains that can be made from trade. This is generally more applicable in macroeconomics and international trade, but it is part of basic economic theory, so I will introduce it now. Specialization is this idea that when we start producing either one or only a few goods, taken in the context of a country, it is possible for a nation to specialize in the production of, let's say, only one good. If this happens, that country will gain insight into more efficient ways of producing that one good, as all its resources are diverted to producing only that one good. This often results in a greater level of efficiency in production, and thus lower prices for consumers. Comparative advantage is defined as the ability of one producer to produce a good at a lower opportunity cost than another producer. Oftentimes, this is associated with efficiency. If one producer has a comparative advantage compared to another, they can be said to be more efficient at producing the good. Absolute advantage, on the other hand, deals with overall productivity. If producer A can produce more of a good regardless of their efficiency than producer B, then producer A is said to have the absolute advantage in the production of a good. The concepts that I have just mentioned are a little complicated to understand, so here is an example that will hopefully clear things up. Imagine an economy with two producers. Producer A is Joe, who runs a clothing factory. He only has one sewing machine in this factory, so he isn't technologically advanced as he otherwise could be. Joe can produce in a given hour either 6 pairs of socks or 30 t-shirts. He can't produce 6 pairs of socks and 30 t-shirts. He can only produce 6 pairs of socks or 30 t-shirts. We will say that he can also produce some combination of t-shirts and socks that satisfy his time constraint. If we do the math, we can say that it takes him 2 minutes to produce a t-shirt and 10 minutes to produce a pair of socks. If we want to know the opportunity cost of producing a pair of socks, we need to think of the best alternative Joe has with the 10 minutes it takes him to make those socks. In 10 minutes, Joe can also produce 5 t-shirts. Thus, the opportunity cost of producing a pair of socks is 5 t-shirts. Similarly, in the 2 minutes it takes Joe to produce a t-shirt, he could have produced a fifth of a pair of socks. I get it, it's not a complete pair, it's more like a little bit of a sock that he has worked on. Thus, the opportunity cost of making a t-shirt is making a fifth of a pair of socks. Our second producer, Liz, also runs a clothing factory. She also only produces socks and t-shirts. The only difference is that in a given hour, Liz can produce either 30 pairs of socks or 30 t-shirts. Thus, she takes 2 minutes to produce a t-shirt and 2 minutes to produce a pair of socks. Thus, she could either use 2 minutes to produce 1 t-shirt or 1 pair of socks. Thus, her opportunity cost of producing a t-shirt is a pair of socks, and her opportunity cost of producing a pair of socks is 1 t-shirt. On the graphs below, we can see Joe and Liz's production possibility frontiers. Essentially, Joe can produce at any point on or inside his production possibilities frontier, and Liz can produce at any point on or inside her production possibilities frontier as well. Neither of them can produce outside of their respective production possibility frontiers. So we've established that both Liz and Joe have different opportunity cost of producing socks and t-shirts, and both can produce different amounts in total. If we look at socks alone, Joe has to sacrifice making 5 t-shirts for every pair of socks he makes, while Liz only has to give up 1 t-shirt for every pair of socks she makes. Thus, since her opportunity cost of producing socks is lower, we can say that Liz has the comparative advantage in producing socks. On the other hand, it costs Joe a fifth of a pair of socks to produce 1 t-shirt, while it costs Liz a full pair of socks to produce a single t-shirt. Thus, since Joe's opportunity cost of producing a t-shirt is lower than Liz's opportunity cost of producing a t-shirt, we can say that Joe has the comparative advantage in producing t-shirts. As for absolute advantage, both can produce the same amount of t-shirts if they focus all their efforts on t-shirt production, but Liz can produce more pairs of socks if she specializes in socks. Thus, nobody has the absolute advantage in terms of t-shirt production, but Liz has the absolute advantage in terms of sock production. The information we extracted from the problem can now be applied to our economy in order to make it even more efficient. We get Joe and Liz to specialize in producing whatever they are more efficient at. Joe has the comparative advantage in producing t-shirts, while Liz has the comparative advantage in producing socks. Thus, Joe will only produce t-shirts and Liz will only produce socks. They then trade with each other. Let's pick some random price that they will trade at, say 2 t-shirts per pair of socks. On the other hand, this would also mean that 1 t-shirt would trade for half a pair of socks. For Joe, this is a good deal, because if he were to produce socks by himself, it would cost him 5 t-shirts to produce. Now he only has to pay Liz 2 t-shirts per pair of socks. This is also a good idea for Liz, because if she were to produce t-shirts by herself, it would cost her a full pair of socks per t-shirt she made. If she trades with Joe, she only needs to pay him half a pair of socks to buy a t-shirt. Both Liz and Joe can buy the good for which they do not have a comparative advantage in producing from the other person. As a general rule of thumb, if the trading price of the goods are less than the opportunity cost of production, then both producers will gain from trade. Liz gains from trade because she can buy t-shirts from Joe at a lower cost than her own opportunity cost of production. And Joe gains from trade because he can buy socks from Liz at a lower cost than his own opportunity cost of production. In essence, if they trade, they can consume outside of their production possibilities frontiers. Do keep in mind, though, that they do not, by any means, produce outside.
Let's talk about the basic foundation of economics. What economics is, what's involved with it, and what the basic economic problem is. The word economy Why do nations trade goods with each other? Nations exchange goods with each other when they expect to gain from the exchange. We call that gains from trade. Adam Smith, a famous economist from the 18th century, talked about this in his book, Wealth of Nations, and so did economist David Ricardo. The theory of comparative advantage teaches us that nations should specialize in the production of the goods in which they have the lowest opportunity cost and trade with other nations. The reason this works is because nations tend to have different resources and they're not equally efficient when they're producing goods, which means that they have different opportunity costs. When they have different opportunity costs of producing goods, it is possible to gain from trading. When both nations trade, they both will experience an increase in output because they don't have to switch between one task and another. They also increase their skill level because they're doing the same task over and over again. This makes them more productive and empowers them to produce at a level that goes beyond their production possibilities curve. For example, let's say that the United States can produce more strawberries with the same amount of resources than Canada can. This means the U.S. has an absolute advantage in the production of strawberries. Now, my first thought about that would be the U.S. should definitely specialize in strawberries because in this example, they're the best at it. But my perspective is nearsighted because I'm not accounting for the concept of opportunity cost, which shows me what the U.S. would have to give up in order to specialize. Having an absolute advantage in the production of a good doesn't always mean that you have a comparative advantage. So let's take this idea further and see where it leads. The U.S. can produce 20 strawberries or 80 apples, while Canada can produce 15 strawberries or 5 apples. That means that the opportunity cost to the United States of producing one strawberry is 80 divided by 20 or 4 apples.